Alright guys, today I'm looking at Russia population and demographics, and the outlook is pretty bleak. Now it's not quite as bad as some other countries, but it's pretty bad all the same. So let's look at this graph. Here the dotted red line, and we can see 2022. The current population is about 145.8 million. Now this is a decrease from its peak back in 1993, which was 148.4 million. But as you can see here, this doesn't tell the full story, because the population decreased pretty rapidly in the 1990s, all the way up until about 2007. But then we can see an increase from 2008 up until 2020. So for 12 years, the population of Russia actually grew quite a bit. It grew from 143.2 to 145.9. So about 2.7 million of an increase. But as you can see here, it's starting to decrease once more. It's decreased from 145.9 to 145.8. So we've lost 100,000 Russians in the last couple of years. And if you look at the trend, it's expected to continue. And we see here a pretty steady drop over the next 30, 40, 50 years. By 2050, the population is expected to be 135.8 million. Which is 10 million less than what it is right now. And by 2080, 127.2 million. And then it's expected to decrease more slowly for the last 20 years of this century, down to 126.3 million by the end of the century. So we're looking at a drop of about 19 million people for the next 80 odd years. So that's a pretty significant drop. It's not quite as bad as some other countries I've already looked at, in particular South Korea. But this growth here in 2008, this might give people some hope for Russia, because this is proof right here that the population can go up once more. Now let's look at the growth rate over here. We can see back in like the 50s and 60s, it was growing at over 1% a year. And then the growth just declines from 1970 to 1985. The growth rate increased, but then from the mid 80s, it dropped significantly, all the way down to 2000, where the growth rate was minus 0.35. So the population was decreasing. And here we can see again that it increased, and now it's going back down again. Between 1993 and 2008, Russia's population saw a considerable decline in its population from 148.37 million to 143.25. During this time, Russia experienced low birth rates and abnormally high death rates. Since then, the population has increased again to 145.93 million. However, the population is expected to reach its peak at the end of 2020 and is projected to start declining again. So Russia has some of the lowest fertility rates in the world, 1.58. Now we're going to look at some other sources where this birth rate is higher. And of course, the replacement rate needs to be at 2.1. So if it's lower than that, the population is going to decrease. Russia has one of the oldest populations in the world. While projections into the future of Russia are very difficult, it's estimated that Russia will fall from the 9th most populous country to 17th by 2050. Vladimir Putin has announced that he plans to boost Russia's dwindling population by encouraging immigration and higher birth rates. But estimates show that Russia's population will drop from 2014's 142 million to only 128 million by 2050. So this initiative by Putin in 2008 worked to a certain extent. So a lot of this is down to more immigration and a slight increase in the birth rate. The Russian economy grew strongly during the first decade of the 20th century. So this might be part of the reason why the population increased. So that by around 2008, we saw a pretty significant increase in immigration. There are also indications that birth rates may be increasing slightly, probably due to a combination of increased confidence in Russia's economic prospects and government incentives to new mothers, especially a $10,000 payment which is made to mothers who have 3 or more children. So these are the kind of initiatives that countries need to be pushing, like $10,000. That's a lot of money in Russia because their standard of living is lower. So $10,000 there will take you a lot further than $10,000 in the US and Western Europe. So if you have 3 or more children, you will get this $10,000. And of course, we have the war right now, Russia invading Ukraine. We have all these sanctions. So Russia's economy is going to take a huge hit, it looks like. And this could impact the population in a big way. So this graph may be way more optimistic because of the war and these sanctions that are going to come in. This graph could be way worse. The population could decrease at a much faster pace than this. The rate of change of the Russian population is very close to 0% at present, and the population isn't expected to change much by 2020. So this is obviously a few years old. Further in the future, it is expected that the population will continue to decline slowly, getting down to 140 million by 2030 and 136 million by 2040. Now, I don't know why they're expecting the population decline to level out here. From about 2080 to 2098, the population is expected to decrease very slowly. This is the problem with these projections. I mean, who the hell knows what the world is going to be like in 2080? What's Russia going to be like in 2080? Again, we have this war right now, so this could have a huge impact on this projection. Right now, there's a net change of minus 247 people a day, so Russia is losing that amount of people per day if you take everything into account, birth rates, immigration, debt rates, and so on. So here are the past numbers. So 2022, we have a very slight growth rate. Back between 2000 and 2010, we saw it was in the red. The population was decreasing. And as I've said, the population actually increased from about 2008. That's why we see the green here right now. But this may not be completely accurate. This might actually be a decrease right now in 2022. According to the graph we saw earlier, the population is going back down again. And looking here in the past, we saw in 1955, the growth rate was 1.6, 1960, 1.49. That growth decelerated, but still it was in the green right up until around 1995, where the population started to decrease. And here are the projections for the future, and it's all red. So a very slight decrease by 2023, and then the decrease is expected to accelerate a bit. So we're looking at 0.31, 0.30 minus. And this is not quite as bad as some other countries, but it's still significant. And how is the economy going to grow when the population is decreasing? And this is a question that's going to face many other countries over the next few decades. So let's look at the fertility rates. And back in the past, 1950, it was 2.8. So way over replacement rate of 2.1. And this is why the population of Russia had been increasing steadily until the mid-1990s. Now, as you can see, time passing, the birth rate decreases. So here, births per woman in 1969 was actually below the 2.1 threshold, but it got up a bit in the 70s and 80s. So it hit 2.1 in 1987, but then it started to go down again below the 2.1 threshold. And then in 1998, it was all the way down to 1.2. And then we see it gone up. Here by 2018, it was up to 1.8, but still below the 2.1 figure. So while it's better than it was, 1.8 is still too low. It needs to be at least 2.1. And here's another graph. And this one goes back to 1840. Now look at these numbers, they're crazy. In 1840, the fertility rate was 7. That means that on average, a Russian woman was having 7 kids. And in 1900, it was up to 7.39. And then throughout the 20th century, it decreased. But because it's still way over 2, the population of Russia still increased at a pretty hefty rate. Now, in 1940 to 1945, it decreased significantly. People weren't having kids during World War II. And by 1945, it was down to 2.58. But it bounced back a bit up towards 3. And then since the 50s and 60s, it's been going down by quite a bit. And then we see it plunging from 1990 to about 2010. And here we see the increase again. So this is proof right here that countries facing population collapse can actually turn things around. So Russia deserves a bit of credit for turning it around in the last 12 odd years. It's now getting up towards the 2.1 again. But of course, as I said, we have the war now, and this could screw everything up. The birth rate could plummet in Russia. And here on the right, we see the historical population. In 1600, it was about 9.5 million. And in 100 years, by 1700, the population had only increased by about 1.2 million. And these are pretty small figures as well, 9-10 million. By 1800, it had increased to 31 million. So big growth in the 18th century. The population grew threefold from 1700 to 1800. And from 1800 to 1897, it more than doubled again to 67 million. And we just see throughout the 20th century, the population increases steadily. And by the 1990s, it had peaked at about 148 million. So this graph is really interesting here, the one on the top. We see in 1940, the population was about 110 million. And we can see the devastating effect of World War II. And by 1945, it had gone down to about 98 million. So in about 5 years, the population decreased by about 12 million. So a massive loss for Russia in World War II. But then after World War II, we can see the population increase at a pretty healthy rate up until the 1990s. Now I want to talk a little bit about communism, because people talk about how communism and all the purges and the gulags and stuff wrecked the Russian population, but that's not true, because we can see a steady increase in the 20th century. Apart from World War II, we can see a pretty steady increase. So communism didn't destroy the population of Russia overall. Now you might have had people getting killed for their political beliefs and so on, but the population during communism did increase. This takes me to another issue, which is, like, people say that economic systems can affect population growth, and some people will argue that, hyper-capitalism will cause a huge economic boom and a huge increase in the population. But under communist Russia, the population of Russia increased at a similar rate as it did in Western Europe and the US at the same time. And the population has been decreasing since like the 1990s in a similar fashion to how it's been decreasing in the West under capitalism. So the political and economic system doesn't explain population increase and decrease, because we see the same trend in Russia as we do in Western Europe and America. And these happened at pretty similar times as well, under very different economic systems. And the graph here at the bottom is also pretty interesting. We can see the 2.1 line in gray. This is the magic number here, 2.1. So when you're underneath that, you're gonna have population decline. And we can see how it dropped during the war, but then it bounced back up. And then from about the 1960s, it's been flirting with this 2.1. It's been up and down a little bit, but right now we can see how it's still under 2.1. Now, it was way worse back around 2000, but it needs to get back at least 2.1 again. And also, I'll just point out that Russia is, of course, the largest country in the world. It's got a land area of over 16 million square kilometers, and the next largest country, Canada, is just over half of that. So Russia is almost twice as big as the second largest country, Canada. It's the largest country in the world, and look at this. Just under 11% of the world's landmass is Russia. So it's absolutely gigantic. It's the largest country in Europe, and it's also the largest country in Asia. So Russia is absolutely massive, but its population of 145.8 million right now, and the peak of like 148 million, means that it's actually pretty sparsely populated. Just 9 people per square kilometer. Ranked 215. So here we go. Russia ranked 215 out of 232. Now these are not all like independent countries, like Falkland Islands, that's belong to the UK. Greenland is part of Denmark. This will just show you how sparsely populated Russia is. Just 9 people per square kilometer, or 22 people per square mile. So Russia could increase, its population. There was talk of wanting to have like 500 million Russians on the planet, 500 million, which honestly we probably could, in theory, deal with, because Russia is so huge. Now, a lot of the land is poor. It's up north. It's permafrost and so on. But there's a lot of really good land in Russia as well that could be used for producing food. So to sum up, guys, Russia does have a huge population issue. And in the last 12 years, we've seen signs of hope that the population might increase or even just level off. Even if it stayed at 148 million or, 150 something million, that could be doable. But with the war happening now and all these sanctions, this projection could be a lot worse, and it could be a disaster. Russia could be facing the same population collapse as the likes of Korea and Japan and some Western countries and other Eastern European countries. So guys, be sure to subscribe. I've done a few countries already, and I plan to do a lot more with their population problems. So leave a comment, let me know what you think. So until next time, see you guys later.